Hey guys, welcome back at the Thisissoul Shop YouTube channel. Today in this video I'm going to tell you everything there is to know about bearing spacers. And if you don't want to watch the entire video, want to have a quick answer about what bearing spacer you should pick, then take the cylindrical 8mm bearing spacer, because these will fit in almost all modern high quality or medium quality to high quality inline skates. If you have a really cheap skate that is below 150 euros, there is a slight chance that they won't fit, and if you have a children's skate, then there's a good chance that these will not fit. More details about bearing spacers, about what's good and what's not good, how to get them out of the skate, and really weird ones that are maybe interesting for you to know about is in this video. So check it out and learn more about inline skating today. We are here right now in Amsterdam in our store. If you have a problem with your wheels, if you want to get some bearing spacers, we have all bearing spacers on the market right here. So you can always drop by with your skates and we can just swap everything, repair it for you. Or if you want to do it yourself, you can just buy everything here, get a cup of coffee and hang out, chill at this clubhouse that we have right here next to the Vondel Park. You're always welcome. If you're an online shopper and you're not able to come to Amsterdam, then you want to dive into depth about this topic. Obviously, you want to continue watching this video. And if you have more questions about this topic, you can try dropping it in the comments of this video, of course, but maybe even a better way is to send us a WhatsApp message or an email with your specific questions and you'll get a detailed answer. The bearing spacer is the topic of this video, and the bearing spacer is the part that sits in a wheel between the bearings. So this is a generic inline skate wheel, and this is a generic inline skate bearing, and there's two bearings on each side of the wheel, and in between these two bearings is the spacer. So if the wheel would be see-through, you would see something like this. Back when I was a teenager, I've been skating since I was like 13. Back when I was a teenager, I didn't really know what these things were for, so I used to just take them out of my skates and, I don't know, throw them out or something, because I just didn't understand it. That was kind of silly of me. I do not recommend it, and I'm gonna explain you why we even have these and what the function is right now. If you tighten the axle, then there will be some pressure on the inner race of a bearing. So there's an outer race, this is the outer circle here, and the inner race is the inner circle, and then between them are some balls. If you push on the inner race, the pressure of your push will transfer to the balls, and because then there is a pressure on the balls, the bearing will roll less good. What the bearing spacer does is then, when you tighten the axle, that same force is not transferred from the inner race to the balls, but it's kind of like it cancels itself out, because you're pushing with the axle not on the balls anymore, but on the bearing spacer itself. So no more pressure on the balls because of the bearing spacer. That's the summary of this whole story. Use this thing, no more pressure on the ball bearings, and you'll roll faster. So what happens if you don't have the bearing spacer? Probably if you don't have the bearing spacer, you'll notice that if you tighten your axle, then if you tighten it really hard, the wheel just stops rolling. So if you give it a jam, it will not work. What people then do if they encounter this problem, then they just don't tighten their axle so that the wheel can still move freely. An axle that is not tightened tightly will come entirely loose when you're skating. So this is really dangerous. You should always tighten your axle to the max. Another thing which will happen, in the slim chance that your axle will not come loose and it will just stay perfectly in place like that, so not really tightened but still a little bit tight, the axle will not have this pressure that we've been talking about on the bearings. But every time you push, every time you stride and move your foot to the side, that same sideways pressure on the bearing will be there as well. So every time you push, you will actually lose speed a little bit, and you don't want that. Same thing happens when you make a sharp turn. There will also be sideways force on your bearing. If you don't have the bearing spacer, this will slow you down. So not having a bearing spacer is really bad, and that sideways force I've been talking about will also destroy your bearings a lot sooner. Wow. Okay, so this little piece of metal makes sure that your bearings last longer and you're going faster, and you won't fall because your axle comes loose. Sounds like a good deal. There's one type of bearing spacer that's used the most. That's this cylindrical 8mm bearing spacer, but there's also a few different ones. I'm gonna first tell the most common ones, and then at the end of this video I'm gonna tell you about a few freaky ones that I've encountered over the years. So there's of course the cylindrical one, but there's also the self-centering bearing spacer. And why would you ever use the self-centering against the cylindrical ones? So first off, some wheels like this Icon wheel, or same for Undercover and God's wheels, they all have the same core. They just don't fit self-centering bearing spacer because the hole is too small, so it will not go through the hole. So in a wheel like that, you have to use the cylindrical one. But if you have another type wheel like this one, which does have a bigger hole, then it's actually quite nice to have a self-centering one, because it's sometimes really hard if you put in the bearings and then you want to put the axle through, to kind of like put the axle through the bearing spacer, and then it helps if there's this extra ring around it. This extra ring helps it to self-center. That's why it's called a self-centering bearing spacer. So this makes it easier to mount your wheels in your frame. Another reason to get the cylindrical bearing spacer against the self-centering one is if you have a metal core wheel, then you need the free-floating aspect of the cylindrical bearing spacer to float it to the side of the space so that you can put an axle in, and then with the hammer you can boom, jam it out. I have an entire video about how to take out bearings, and also this goes into depth about how to take it out with a metal core. It's a little bit complicated. If you know the trick, then it's easy, but watch the video, then you know everything about that. All right, so these are the two main ones. They're for 8mm axles. Almost all modern inline skates have an 8mm axle. This is also the inner diameter of a bearing. It's also 8mm, so that's perfect. But back in the day, like in the 90s, a lot of the skates had a 6mm axle, so they also needed some sort of adapter between the axle and the bearing, and that's these. These bearing spacers are a lot bigger. They actually work pretty nice against what we've been talking about, like tightening of your axles. So if you have a 6mm bearing spacer, then it helps even more with canceling out the force of tightening your axles, so that it doesn't come on your bearings and doesn't slow the wheel down. But the 6mm axles are also a little bit weaker, so that's why the industry moved forward and got to the 8mm standard. So in some old school skates you can still find these ones, and in some children's skates you can also find them. Please pay attention that if you have an old school skate or children's skate and it comes with like a nylon or plastic version of these, please replace them, because a bearing spacer is pretty cheap, and you can go like twice as fast on them if you have a metal one of these. So then between these two 6mm spacers, there's two different versions. Basically there's Roaches, which has exactly 6mm axles, and then there's everybody else, which has 6.3mm axles. So if you have a Roaches skate, you need these copper ones, and otherwise you can have these blue ones, or like they're also come in silver and all sorts of colors. So those are the 4 main type of bearing spacers there are. The biggest problem that occurs with bearing spacers is that they're not wide enough. And you can imagine this is kind of like a little tube, right? And if you look at how this is made, it's pretty funny because this little tube comes from a really long tube, and you can kind of think about it as a straw where you drink from. If you take a straw like that, but make it from metal, and then you just cut it into pieces, then you have all these little bearing spacers. That's how it's made. But at the end of that straw, if you at the really end, then sometimes the last part is kind of like not exactly the same length as that you would use for the complete product. So that last part kind of like sometimes gets thrown away, but sometimes it also gets into the production and it comes into a skate. So if you have like a fresh skate, you never used it, but one of the wheels, if you tighten the axles, one of the wheels just doesn't roll really good. What happens sometimes is that it's like kind of like a malfunctioning bearing spacer because it's kind of like the end of the straw type bearing spacer. So it's a little bit shorter than the rest, and if it doesn't touch, then it doesn't work. So if you ever have something like that, just try a different bearing spacer that you have laying around. Just experiment a little bit with that and see if you can solve that problem. There's also Power Slide, which has bearing spacers which are really specific, like up to the hundreds of millimeter specific. So you can have kind of like you can get like a bigger or smaller one to solve your problem. Now, as the last part of this video, I'm gonna dive into a few weird type bearing spacers to kind of like freak you out. And the first one I want to touch on is this Power Slide. Well, it's actually the Wicked brand adjustable bearing spacer. So let's say you have this problem where your bearing spacer doesn't do its proper job, then you can also solve this by putting in an adjustable bearing spacer. It has this funny little clamps that you can put on once everything is mounted. Well, once the bearings are in the wheel, at least mounted, then you can still put these little clamps in, and then with those there's some thread in this bearing spacer. See, there's 2 parts, and with this thread you can expand it to make a perfect fit. Let's see, the next freaky bearing spacer. All bearing spacers on the market are about 1 centimeter wide, but Icon just released one that's a lot smaller, and they made it because they have like special bearings which are also wider, and you need those bearings for their special frames. But if you don't want to use them in their special frames, you can flip those bearings inside out, and then you need a special bearing spacer. So it's a very specific product, probably not going to encounter it, but it's the only, like, it's one of a kind of weird thing on the market. Then there's also magnetic bearing spacers, and they go in these LED wheels, so LED wheels which emit light. If you put it in, it kind of like works as a dynamo, and then if you spin it, it generates electricity and a light pops up. So it only works with these special bearing spacers, and of course with the special matching wheels for them. Mix them together and then magic. Then there's this weird bearing. This bearing doesn't need a bearing spacer because it has like an extended inner race, and the idea is that it touches, both bearings touch each other in the inside. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is so smart. And then I tested it and it didn't really work. I don't know why. My wheels kind of like were ticking a little bit, and I cannot figure out the real reason behind it, but at the end of the day, this was not really good for inline skating, I think. But maybe somebody else has some different experience with it. Please let me know if you do. Then the last bearing spacer is a very special one that I want to discuss. And this comes from my very first inline skate that I ever had, and that was a Bauer FX skate. It's kind of like a hard boot, old school, kind of like a hockey skate that I used for aggressive skating. I learned my first front side grinds on it. That at a certain point I wanted to change my wheels, and then I destroyed my frame because of this stupid bearing spacer. And because, well, it's not the bearing spacer, it's me. I'm stupid. I was stupid. Now I know better, and I want to inform you guys about if you ever have an old Bauer skate and want to pick it apart, please be aware of a bearing spacer like this. So what happens is this bearing spacer has thread in it, and instead of having an axle, there's just a screw that's screwing in the bearing spacer itself. And if you take out one, let's say, imagine that there's a frame surrounding this. If you take out one, as soon as you unscrew it, there's no way, it seems, to unscrew the next one, because if you screw it, just the whole thing will rotate and you cannot stop it. Little did I know that there's kind of like a hex shape on the inside where you can put an Allen key in, and the Allen key holds the bearing spacer in position, and then you can unscrew the second one just safely, and then it just works pretty good. But if you don't figure that out, you're gonna destroy your frame. So be aware. I hope you learned a lot in this video about this little tiny part that comes in all inline skate, the bearing spacer. Seems like there's nothing to it, but when you dive into it, there's actually a whole world of bearing spacers. Every week I make a video like this, and I let you discover a complete topic, and I tell you everything I know about that topic. So if you like content like this, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye bye. All right, let me check. You're such an expert. That's so good. Oh, boom, like a, oop. Ah, that was not smooth.